Ka'ohanui, Iarana, Kia ora. Well, glad to see you all today. I want to also jump right in and talk about the evolving Marquesan agricultural niche and a view from Nuku Hiva. Our understanding of Marquesan agricultural systems comes largely from 18th and 19th century historical accounts. European visitors were very impressed with the luxuriant Marquesan plantations, neatly laid out, well cared for, and their observations also suggest that the systems were dominated by breadfruit. But was this always the case? And when and why did tree crop cultivation and breadfruit in particular become central to the Marquesan agroeconomy? There have been several hypotheses put forward. Robert Suggs, for example, who pretty much wrote the phasing of Marquesan cultural history, argued that root crops were really important early on. Breadfruit came later. Millerstrom and Coyle argued from some wood charcoal evidence from Hatiheu Valley that there was shifting cultivation, little evidence for shifting cultivation, and that perhaps breadfruit was very important from the very beginning of the sequence. So to try and address these questions, myself and students and colleagues have been working over several years now, looking at building a multi-proxy record for Nuku Hiva with a variety of different kinds of materials. And as Jennifer Kahn and Patrick Kirch have shown, and along with colleagues, this can really strengthen the accuracy and the precision of the kinds of interpretations we can make. They have different formational histories, but together they bring us this really more robust understanding of the past. We're not just interested in the inventory of plants. We also want to understand the processes that underlie agricultural development. And so to facilitate that, I have drawn on what's called niche construction theory. I won't spend a lot of time on this, but I want to highlight three things. One, it asks you to focus on the creation of human spaces, talking less about destructive aspects of human arrival. It also asks that we think about how things have been intergenerational in terms of their effects, what's called ecological inheritance. And it wants us to look at these dynamic feedback relationships, not only between people and animals, but also the whole range of species that occupy a human and anthropogenically formed niche. So it's the co-creation of selective environments that we are looking at. And so I'm going to briefly talk about some of our evidence and then a couple of emerging symbioses. And finally, I'll briefly touch on drivers of change and try and bring it all together within the next 15 minutes. All right, so we have a number of study locales that are shown there, including, importantly, a pollen core from the center of the island at 810 meters. And so we're drawing from a range of valleys across the windward coast in particular. Most people are familiar with the chronological framework of Robert Suggs, but while he laid out the sequence in pretty rather remarkable accuracy, his dating, as we've heard earlier, was somewhat problematical. And now we've brought together some 80 plus radiocarbon dates, largely on short-lived materials. So we have a really robust chronologic sequence for understanding agricultural change. And that's just a summary. And it shows also that with our new radiocarbon dating, we've compressed that sequence that Suggs initially developed in terms of human arrival and changes since. The site of Ho'umi Beach on the eastern coast is really important for us in terms of establishing an ecological baseline. We have dated a deposit below cultural layers that is firmly dated now with some 10 radiocarbon dates to around the 12th century AD. What's interesting is that in this particular deposit below cultural layers, cultural settlement layers, we have evidence of a nearly pristine intact forest that's dominated by pandanus and also by palms. There's a few hardwood trees in there, but in large part, Polynesian cultigens are altogether lacking. We have a wonderful seed record that's been identified by Tara Lewis, which has extinct species, extirpated species, things that are no longer found in the lowlands. And we have an incredible record of insects that Nick Porsche has looked at. And most of these insects are native. There's some 100 taxa that he's identified. But there are 3 that are Polynesian introductions, including a couple ants, this interesting beetle, and an earwig. So what we're seeing is, along with these newly introduced insects, there's also microcharcoal, and we're really seeing what I think of as the first fingerprint of Polynesians. When we look at other valleys across the windward coast, they're somewhat later, about 1300 AD. We've got evidence of forest felling, clearing the landscape through burning. Sometimes that creates sediment mobilization. So a very different sort of sequence from what we see in Ho'umi. But if we turn to the kinds of plants that are showing up in these early sites, we have sort of a timeline that's developing from the different kinds of proxies. With these date to the timing of cultural settlements. In terms of the wood charcoal, we've got a number of different cultigens coming in. Breadfruit and candlenut are both early. Tahitian chestnut is really very interesting. It looks like a secondary introduction potentially. It has a very distinctive wood that would be hard to misidentify. And Jennifer Hubert, who's done the wood charcoal studies, has looked at some 6,000 pieces of charcoal. So it's unlikely that she missed it in the process. We also know from Jenny and Emily's work that it is in the societies around the 1300s. So perhaps it was a secondary introduction to the Marquesans. The microfossil evidence is giving us a picture of the herbaceous component of the agricultural record. And we've had Mark Horrocks, who's recently tied down taro. We hope to submit that paper soon. He's got a couple of additional plant materials along with starch. We also have possible sweet potato at this time, tea, banana, kava, yam a little bit later. Ella Usher has also been looking at microfossils from shell tools. So we've got this package, this set of crops that we can now track in terms of time. And one emerging picture is that the 3 ethnographic staples, breadfruit, banana, and taro, arrived at initial colonization. Digging down into the wood charcoal trends, there's a few things I'd like to quickly bring out. This is from the paper that Jen Hubert and I published in Journal of Archaeological Archaeology. If you look at the early pie chart, we've got a lot of native forest represented. Those are hardwood species, including some unidentified hardwoods that may be extinct. This is from a drier valley where we might expect high diversity. In the middle period, we've got coconut declining rather dramatically. So this suggests that coconut is part of the native vegetation. And at the same time, we've got rosewood or mi'o expanding dramatically. So that is very interesting. And then moving to the late period, we have an expansion of the Polynesian introductions, and those are dominated by breadfruit, but we're also seeing the native forest reestablish itself, suggesting that maybe there's some ecological benefit to breadfruit production. Then I want to draw attention quickly to what I think are evolving mutualisms in the middle period. That's a very dynamic period, I think. We have disturbance indicators increasing, suggesting open areas, swiddening, flash and burn sort of cultivation. Those are dominated by hibiscus, which is almost absent from the early part of the record. So it's really moving into these open areas, taking advantage of them. It may not be intentionally promoted by people, but it is liking their spaces. And we also see, as I said, the efflorescence of mi'o, and this is a really important hardwood. So we think this is management. And then lastly, we have a little bird increasing, beanie, or the little parrot, which feeds on hibiscus, mio, breadfruit, banana, all of the things that are expanding as we move into the late period. And this is one of the few native birds that has persisted into the 21st century. And it may be that these human activities are actually providing habitat and food resources for this important bird. Now, I want to quickly move to a couple of things that may be relevant or possible drivers. This is the diagram from Tobii. It's a pollen influx diagram. We've got a sediment change that takes place about 1650. We've got a pollen production increase. So the amount of pollen in the environment is increasing, suggesting more plants. And those together suggest potentially rainier conditions. And that just happens to coincide with the Little Ice Age. So there may be this climate change that is sort of pushing development of breadfruit production. The other thing that happens at the same time are markers of socio-political change. So the traditional Marquesan pai, which anyone who's been to the Marquesas will be familiar with, they are small, some of them are extraordinarily large, some are quite ornamented. So they seem to reflect increasing social-political differentiation. They almost all date to after 1650, based on the records that I've developed from Anaho, and also from examples around the Marquesas. So that story may not hold for all valleys and all places, but it certainly seems to be the case on parts of Nuku Hiva. And along with those, we see the appearance of storage facilities, some of them quite large, many of them on the pai, or next to the pai. All right, so pulling this all together, we have this evolving agricultural niche that starts with the translocation of Polynesian biota, establishing those crops on the landscape, clearing of the native forest. And then we seem to have this period where lots of disturbance indicators, native coconut gets reduced, secondary vegetation increases. And then around between 1400 and 1600, I think we're seeing the sort of incipient agroforestry with new mutualisms developing, mio increasing, toa comes in, it seems, Tahitian chestnut or ihi may be arriving. And it's after 1650 that we start to see breadfruit really dominating the wood charcoal assemblages in particular, but also showing up in the microfossils that have been looked at by several specialists. And we know that we also have really intensive development of breadfruit by Marquesan people with over some 30 varieties that are known at Western contact. So that is sort of the Marquesan story in a nutshell. And as I look for pictures of to illustrate this talk, I was really reminded of how this is the ecological inheritance of contemporary Marquesans, with many of those traditions and opportunities that were developed by their ancestors still persisting into the 21st century. Everything from carving to the persistence of beanie to the important place of breadfruit. But I'd just like to thank a lot of people. I've been working there a long time, and many people have been helpful and involved. In particular, Madame Yvonne Katupa, who's mayor of Hatiheu. I happen to have Moitai Huioto in the audience today. I'm so pleased to see him. He and his family have been so important to the work that we've done. The service and the High Commission have also been wonderful in terms of permits and logistics, funding sources, of course, but also the specialists who have put all of these analyses out there, undertaken the work, and I'd like to thank all of them as well. So, maruru ka'ohanui.